So, what happens when a neuroscientist, someone who's dedicated their entire life to the physical nuts and bolts workings of the brain, comes face to face with something that, well, science just can't explain? Get a load of this. That's a quote from Dr. Tara Swart. It's a claim that basically pits her entire career against her own personal experience. So you've got to ask, how in the world did a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, a woman of pure science end up here? You see, her journey didn't start in a lab with test tubes and brain scans. No. It began with a personal tragedy, something that completely shattered her world and forced her to stare right into the absolute limits of everything she thought she knew. Okay, before we dive any deeper, we have to talk about her credentials because they're absolutely key here. Dr. Swart isn't just some casual observer, she's a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist. I mean, think about that for a second. She has literally been the person in the room making the tough clinical calls about what is and isn't sane. And that is exactly what makes her story so unbelievably compelling. Back in 2021, her husband Robin passed away from leukemia. And just to make it even more heartbreaking, his death was just 2 days before their 4th wedding anniversary. She said she was just totally lost, completely broken, watching as everything she believed in just seemed to fall apart. And it was right there, in that place of profound grief, that things started to happen, things that just couldn't be explained. So right after her husband passed, weird stuff started happening. And at first, her super scientific brain just tried to brush it all off. But pretty soon, they became absolutely impossible to ignore. It started small. Robins, which was her late husband's name, they started appearing constantly in her garden. Then for weeks, she'd wake up freezing cold, just bone-chillingly cold, a feeling she later connected to him being in the morgue. But the real turning point? A massive thump on her shoulder one night that literally jolted her awake. Right after that thump, she opened her eyes, and she could see this hazy, kind of vague version of her husband right there beside the bed. She just watched, completely frozen, as the image got clearer, and then, just like that, it dissolved from the top down. For a scientist, that's not just a weird dream. No, this was a head-on collision with the impossible. So, what does a scientist do when faced with something totally unexplainable? Well, she doesn't just throw her hands up and abandon science. No way. She uses it to investigate. And this kicked off a huge deep dive into research, trying to find any scientific framework, anything at all that could possibly explain what she experienced. Let's start with this number, 34. This number, right here, just blows up our most basic idea of reality. See, we're all taught we have 5 senses, right? But the scientific literature, it shows we have at least 34. This includes non-conscious ones, like our ability to sense the pH level of our own blood. Just that simple fact suggests our brains are filtering out a way bigger reality than we're ever consciously aware of. And look, Dr. Swart was incredibly critical of herself through all this. She was asking the hard questions. Was this some kind of grief-induced psychosis? She was even experiencing something called thought insertion, having a thought that isn't your own, which is a classic symptom of schizophrenia. She was basically turning her own psychiatric training on herself. Talk about intellectual honesty. She actually found a potential explanation in a field called neuroaesthetics. It's the science of how our brains process things like art and beauty. And there's this model from that field that shows that certain states, like high creativity and maybe, just maybe, profound grief, put the brain into this really unique state. It ramps up connections between different brain regions, it makes you notice things you normally wouldn't, and it actually lowers the brain's natural filter. This kind of vulnerable state could literally make the brain more open to seeing the world in a completely new way. Okay, so her research then started to expand. It went beyond just her own mind and her own experience, and she started looking into phenomena documented by other scientists, specifically stuff that happens at the very, very edge of life and death. Okay, take terminal lucidity, for example. This is a real medically documented thing where a person with a brain that is, for all intents and purposes, completely destroyed, we're talking late-stage Alzheimer's, will suddenly wake up, be totally lucid, talk to their family, and seem perfectly fine, only to pass away a few hours later. And here's the kicker. Mainstream neuroscience has absolutely no explanation for how a physically wrecked brain can suddenly start working perfectly again. None. And then you have near-death experiences. Dr. Bruce Grayson, a researcher who's looked at over 5,000 cases, tells this absolutely mind-blowing story. An ICU patient saw his favorite nurse during his NDE. She told him to go back and to tell her parents she was sorry about the red MG. Well, when the patient woke up, he was told something impossible. That same nurse had just died in a car crash. The car? A brand new red MG her parents had just given her. I mean, come on, how could he possibly have known that? All right, so after all this, the personal signs, the clinical phenomena, all of it, how does a neuroscientist put it all together? Well, she forms a new hypothesis, a new way to see. But here it is, right? The big question. The one every skeptic is thinking. Isn't this all just confirmation bias? I mean, if you're looking for signs, won't you start seeing them everywhere? It's like when you buy a new car, and then all of a sudden you see that exact same model all over the road. And you know what? That phenomenon is totally real. It's rooted in a part of your brain called the reticular activating system, or RAS for short. Think of it like your brain's bouncer. It stands at the door and decides what information gets your attention and what just gets ignored as background noise, all based on what it thinks is important for your survival. But Dr. Swart's take on this is, well, it's pretty radical. Instead of seeing this as a bias we have to fight against, she says we should use it. We can actually consciously prime our own brain's filter to look for beauty, for connection, for signs. I mean, what if we can direct our own attention to expand our reality instead of just letting our brain automatically limit it for us? And this all leads to the ultimate, absolutely mind-bending question. What if things like terminal lucidity and near-death experiences, what if they aren't just weird glitches in the system? What if they are actually glimpses of a fundamental truth, that consciousness isn't made by the brain but can actually exist on its own? What if that's been true all along and we just haven't been looking?